How are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you. I had requested your book from your publicist, and I have loved reading it.
Oh,
So I just want to
good.
jump in here. And first of all, I want to
Yeah,
ask you an origin story
sure.
question. Your first big book that we all have heard about, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, was huge and probably created a stir that you did not expect.
That's
And
correct.
the good and the bad that comes with this. What made you think you wanted to do this again? Or did you
That's,
not?
I didn't. That's actually a really, really good question. So, when the Making of Biblical Womanhood hit so big, and I was taken very much by surprise by it, and there was a lot of responses, both positive and negative,
Yes.
that made me be like, I don't want to ever do this again. I was just like, this is my one hit wonder. I'm out of
Yeah.
here. And so when Brazos, the book has now sold 100,000 copies. We just announced that. And
Yeah, it's
so
amazing.
I've learned how lucky I was. And I also learned when it sold so much the first week or two, of course, I got an email from my press being like, hey, Beth, have you thought about doing another one?
Yeah.
And my first response was, no, I'm out of here. I don't even want to think about it. And I had a conversation with Scott McKnight, who kind of helped me process through a lot of what happened early on. And he said, Beth, that's fine. If you don't want to write again, don't let a publisher pressure you into writing again. But then he said something. He said, but if there's something that you feel like you still want to say,
Yeah.
he said, then don't close the door on it.
Mm,
And so I told the press, I said, look, I'll have to think about this. And I thought about it for several months. And finally, it came from sort of my scholarship as well as the response
yeah.
to me. I put out a question. I was like, if I write on something else, what would you like me to write on? And that got like more than 100,000 views on Twitter. And the number one thing people said, they were like, we want you to talk about being a pastor's wife. And I was like, I don't really want to write a
Didn't
memoir
we
on
talk about
being,
this
I was like,
already?
I don't really want to do that. But then I was reading a book by one of my colleagues at Baylor, Betsy Flowers, Elizabeth Flowers, and she has this great book called Into the Pulpit, and it's on Southern Baptist women and power in the post-World War II era. And in it, she's talking about the rise of the conservative resurgence, which is the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist
Mhm.
Convention. And one of the things that I noticed that she was talking about was that it was pastors' wives who were on the vanguard of this
Mhm.
conservative movement pushing against
Okay.
female pastors.
Hmm.
And that caught my attention. And I
Interesting.
was like, maybe there's a history here. And that was the beginning of this book.
Yeah, I love that. Scott, has he written like 90 books?
Oh, he's written so many.
I cannot keep up with how many books
I
he's
love it.
written.
Well, and one of the beautiful things about Scott too is he takes younger theologians and pastors
Yes.
and
Yes.
scholars and he partners with them and
Yes.
helps
He's
them
like,
learn how
you
to
have
do that.
something interesting to say.
Right.
I know some publishers, and your name
Yeah,
will be on this book too. Like he, is never like, I did this by myself, which I really love.
exactly.
I really
I
love
love
about
that
him.
too. So,
Although I have some funny Scott stories. I was working as a subcontractor for somebody who was working with HarperCollins, and they wanted to
oh,
set up like podcast interviews for Scott. And of course, he doesn't need this, right? Like his books will sell, they're fine. And for me to like figure out his schedule, he doesn't use a scheduler. His way of doing this would be to send me a screenshot of his calendar,
that
which was
sounds like him.
accurate for that one moment in
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
And he's like, I'm available between 1 and 2 on Tuesdays. Good luck. It was hilarious. I would
I bet so.
sometimes talk to Laura and be like, can you talk to your dad and just see if maybe Calendly might work for him? He's like, no, I just don't think we're gonna go there. I don't think that's gonna happen. So, but I have also seen what you've seen, like he elevates other voices and
Yes.
women in particular too, which I am so grateful for. So you mentioned history, which if people don't know who you are, history's your thing. History's your
Yeah,
jam. You
it
are in
is
higher
indeed.
ed. But you have like two things happening. In one hand, you have this great love of history and access to how to find things. In the other
Yes.
hand, you have several decade experience as a pastor's wife.
Yeah.
So how did those two things help come together to create something special for this book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, my whole academic life has walked side by side
Yeah.
with me being a pastor's wife. So there's really not a separation of these two things for me. It's just that's been how I've lived for 26, 27 years now. However long I've been married. My husband actually remembers that better than I do. But nonetheless, they've always been things that I've had to reconcile to some
Hmm.
degree, but I've also always realized how separate they are. Many times, being an academic, I would find myself downplaying my role as a pastor's wife. And being a pastor's wife, I would find myself downplaying my life as an academic
Interesting.
because they seem to be somewhat undermining. And this is something I had to come to terms with myself that in my pastor's wife world, it was a turnoff to people to find out that I was an academic, that I was planning and going into my own career, that I was doing all of these professional things. And so I would dial that down. And then being in an academic world where I was working on women's history, I'm a medievalist, but I work on church history and
Yeah.
women's history. And so while I was in graduate school was during the time when the Southern Baptist Convention was about to pass what we call the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message, which emphasizes that women's divinely ordained role is in the home and
Mm-hmm.
not being in pastoral leadership. And so all of this is going on in the public while I'm a Southern Baptist pastor's wife. And I was in North Carolina at the time. And one of the major ringleaders of this push in the Southern Baptist Convention was Paige Patterson and his wife,
Yeah.
Dorothy Patterson, who literally lived down the street from, down the road from us. I was
Yeah.
at Chapel Hill and they're in Wake Forest at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So I was having to juggle both of these parts of my life and realizing that they simply did not mesh together in in a very clear way. So,
Was that surprising to you? Or were you like, oh, this might happen, but not? Or was it like totally
so,
blindsided?
I think now as a scholar looking back and understanding the history of the Southern
Yeah.
Baptist Convention, I now realize that when I was growing up in it was during this shift. So my world as a child was not as anti women serving in these types of roles as it had become by the time I was a young adult in graduate school. So honestly, I did not realize how big the pushback was going to be. We interviewed somebody for a podcast we have coming out about that stems from this book. And I remember one of the things she said, I had a profound deafness to the resistance to women in pastoral roles. And I would say that I probably had a similar sort of deafness to how much my professional career as a professor and historian, how much people would be suspicious of that
Yeah.
within my conservative evangelical world. And so it was something I had to come to terms with.
That is something that plays out in so many ways in our lives, I think. The water that we grew up swimming in and we think is normal. We don't realize,
Yes.
like, what do you mean?
Yes.
What the hell is water? The one fish says to the other fish,
Yeah.
like, what do you mean? You take it for granted. And I think it's such a great illustration of the fact that things were changing.
Hmm.
And that is one of the arguments of your book is that we
Right.
haven't always thought the same way about women in ministry and how that means and how they have authority from the beginning of time. But we assume that what is normal for us would be normal
Exactly.
forever and for all time. Or at least what
Exactly.
I'm experiencing right now is maybe the way it's supposed to be.
It should always be,
It should
right?
always be. Absolutely. One of the interesting things when you started out this, like some of the early anecdotes in the book, you're talking about pastors candidating or interviewing for jobs. Do they
Yeah.
call it candidating still? I don't even know. That's a very like Christian church.
I didn't hear that term until we were in a non-Southern Baptist church. It
Okay.
was like this, so I
I
never
grew up
heard
in the
it.
Christian and Missionary Alliance denomination and they
Yeah.
did candidating.
Okay. See, I heard it in a conservative evangelical
Okay.
church,
So that
but
makes sense.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, so the stories about the questions that are asked and the just taking for granted that there would be a 2-for-1
Yes.
deal. It was interesting to me. It brought me back to a story. My husband and I met at Bible College in Minnesota,
Oh, yeah.
and I taught. He worked in IT. I worked as the admin to the academic dean, which is a whole faculty world. It was wild. I worked on the staff side for a long time,
Yeah.
very different than working with
Yes.
faculty. But when I worked in the business office, the woman I reported to, her husband, who is a Bible professor, had been a pastor his like early years and was telling me about a time when he went to candidate at a church. They show up and it's a Sunday morning and they ask, and it might have been her, he's just filling the pulpit one week.
Right.
And they come and say, "So what will you be playing this morning?"
That, you know, I've heard
What song
so
have you prepared?
it is, it really is crazy when we think about what we assume
Yeah.
women will do when their husbands are become pastors.
Yes.
And when you grow up in that space, this is one of the things. I grew up in the space where the pastors' wives did all these things, and I would hear people critique them. And to me, that was normal. That was what you did as a pastor's wife. And so it's really fascinating when you step outside of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
And
when you say, I want to be helpful, of course I want to help my
yes,
husband succeed. And
yes.
I will do the thing that I'm supposed to do to help them succeed. I do think you need to step out to be like, what? What did they? What?
Yeah,
What?
it's not until you get on the outside and you're like, wait a minute, you're expecting me to do these things without any compensation, and if I don't do them, then it reflects badly on my husband who you hired for this job. It's
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
just like, what?
And I think the influence of that idea on all of Christendom and all
Hmm.
Christian nonprofits, any organization, I think we take that for granted too. Like I hold here in my little hands this little book here on tree
Oh,
leadership.
yes.
20
What
years of
is
practical business wisdom from the trenches. Let me tell you about the interview process. I just want to share this with you. My husband worked for Dave. So I went through this. Part 11 from the interview process is the spousal interview.
Oh my gosh. Yep.
This may be the best advice in the whole book, he says. A hire is a huge decision. The last interview we do is an informal dinner with the department leader and their spouse, and the hire and their spouse. And one reason he says is because one of the biggest benefits I have found in this process, which I didn't recognize on the front end, is by doing the spousal interview, you will discover if your hire is married to crazy. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Oh, well, first of all, Dave Ramsey, if you think about his business structure and the circles that he runs in, it very much is this conservative evangelical world.
I
And
didn't
so
think
it's
anything
not,
of it.
yeah,
I
it's
went to
not
that
at all
spousal interview.
surprising. Well, that's because I think the reason that we aren't surprised by that is because we see this with the pastor's wife role. It becomes
Yeah,
this model that, of course, wives are supposed to support their husband's job and center their
yeah.
lives on supporting their husband's job. So you're an asset
Oh yeah, I
to
had
your
read this
husband.
book beforehand. I knew what I
Hmm.
was supposed to do. I was going to ace that spousal interview, and I did.
Yep.
He was hired, and I did this thing. It was like a ministry wife, only they didn't specifically ask, but I ended up helping like co-lead. Like the legal name of the company is the Lampo Group. They have this Facebook group called Lampo Ladies.
Oh,
I want to
really?
laugh just to say it.
Yeah.
It is mostly spouses
Uh-huh.
of the guys that work there, but of course they don't just hire guys. And like I would like help organize events, keep
Yeah.
them from gossiping about things they shouldn't be talking, keep them from complaining. I would take new women around town and show them and good places, churches. Like
Right.
it was a whole thing. Did I work there? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I did not. My husband
Yeah.
worked there. And it was like I took on this, but it felt like that, we were in this together.
That's exactly right. And And you don't think about the type of labor that you get. I mean, all of those things that you were doing, organizing, taking people around, are things then that the company does not have to do to help people get settled and integrated. And so it's this huge expectation that we
Yeah.
put on women. And yet, as women who grow up in these cultures, we're like, this is normal.
Yeah.
This is what we do.
Until
Such
somebody outside of the culture like interviews in and they're like, "What?
exactly.
You're not even
It's
supposed to know if I'm married,
That's
right? Let's
exactly right. It's
that's
exactly
not
right.
even legal to ask
And
those
I think
questions."
about it with, it's one of the things that an example I brought up in my book is no one expects my husband to step into my classroom to teach
Yeah.
when I am unavailable or something has come up. He doesn't grade my papers for me. I mean, it's crazy. Nobody expects that of him. But yet, if the roles are reversed, that's what
Yeah.
there's expectations on me. That's
So
exactly right.
as you were working on researching this is a big, huge to do. And of course, this book is the answer to this question. But like in a nutshell, like what's one thing that like surprised you as you started digging into the history of women
Yeah.
and ordination and ministry?
Yeah. So I often explain the making a biblical womanhood was me telling a story I already knew.
Hmm.
It was a story I'd been teaching for a long time. Becoming the pastor's wife is me telling a story I didn't know all the pieces to. So there were actually a lot of things that I learned along the way while writing this. And one of them, even though I knew this story a little bit, I didn't fully understand the shift in what happened with ordination
Hmm.
across the Central Middle Ages. And so that was actually a big one in realizing how much ordination got redefined, I suppose, in many ways, which I
Yeah.
think probably will shock a lot of people because we tend to think that ordination is somewhat of a static thing throughout history, this
Oh yeah.
recognition.
Yeah.
But it's actually something that has shifted considerably over time and is different depending on what type of faith group you are a part of. It is not static at all. So I would say that really understanding the influence and a leadership authority that early medieval women exercised is something that researching this book really drove home to me when
Yeah.
I realized that early medieval abbesses functioned like bishops and essentially carried the authority of what we would equate with bishops today, and exercising very clear teaching and pastoral authority over both women and men, including other male leaders within the church. So, this book really helped me to understand how far the modern evangelical world has come
Yeah.
from that early church and early medieval world in which women were functioning in these types of pastoral roles.
One of the things that you said that is a tendency of our modern conservative churches and pushing back against women in pastor positions or being an authority over men is that when somebody says, "But what about this, Deborah?" And what
Right,
about like this missionary over in Africa? And usually the answer you said was that it was an exception. They
right.
mentioned these women as like, well, they stood, they filled in because nobody else was
Exactly.
willing to do. No man was there doing what he was supposed to do. Tell me more about that and what you learned
Oh,
about
yeah.
that.
No, I'm really glad you picked up on that. That's something that has become a theme recently in my classes because often when we think about women in early church leadership roles, and we're like, oh, well, yes, there was Hildegard of Bingen was there, or Deborah was there, but these were exceptions that sort of prove the rule. That these women are here, and the reason we know about them is because they were so extraordinary. And actually, when you look at the history, what you find is that these women are not as exceptional as we think they are. That actually, there are a lot of women who are fulfilling these roles. And this is something I really tried to get across with my chapter on medieval abbesses, that there are so many of these women who are serving in these very clear leadership and ordained roles in the early church. And so they're not actually exceptional. They're
Yeah.
not extraordinary. If we look at even the biblical world and the early, one of my favorite sections is where I tell the story of visiting the Priscilla catacombs
Yeah,
in the early church. And I'm doing this actually with my son's senior class in high school. We were on his trip. And the Priscilla catacombs is just one of these places that shows us how ordinary women were in serving in leadership roles in the early church. And I think I say in that chapter, the evidence is literally written on the walls
I
um,
love that. I
by the
love
early
that.
church itself. And
Yeah,
we just have been trained to only see these women as exceptional
yeah.
when they actually are just ordinary, ordinary leaders in the church.
Yeah, you didn't have to do any special digging to find these women,
No,
evidence of these women throughout the
no,
centuries. They
no,
were right
they're
there.
they're right there. And I think, I think part of this is the gap between the church and academic scholarship.
Yeah,
Although I think some of it too is even as academics, we have learned over time that the way we classify these women often makes them seem like extraordinary. Like I would actually say as a medievalist, oftentimes we talk about early medieval theologians, we qualify women as what we call mystics.
yeah.
And I'm actually not sure if that is a great title for them
Hmm.
because what it does is it separates them out from the other male theologians as if women are doing something that's different and less than men. When reality, these are just women serving as theologians, just like the men serving as theologians, and their
Yeah,
voices are just as powerful and just as influential in the medieval world. They didn't call themselves mystics. That was a
right.
term that was coined in the 19th century to regard these
Yeah.
women, and in some ways, separating them and saying, oh, but what they're doing is different.
Yeah.
But it's
But
actually not.
I would say, I bet you get some pushback from people that would be like, but what, these people had strayed from what Paul said, about I don't allow women to
Yes.
teach. I
Yeah.
mean, Paul, he was pretty clear there about the thing. And this certainly, Dr. Barr, this was not happening when Paul was writing and teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes. That's actually so easy to debunk because,
About that.
yeah, I mean, so one of the things I did in the Making of Biblical Womanhood is I used one of my regular teaching things in my class where I simply have students turn to Romans 16 and make a list of all of the names that they see in
Hmm.
it. And then we look up to make sure we know which are women and which are men. And then I have them write down what those people are doing. It's just a
Yeah.
list. And then we walk through it. And my students usually are like, oh my gosh, there are women. There's a deacon, there's an apostle, there's female church leaders, and Paul is commending all of them and telling people to work alongside them, etc. And so by the time we get to the end of the list, we're like, wait a minute, Paul is has all of these women who are
Yeah.
working right alongside them in these same type of leadership roles, and there's not a problem. So if we then read First Timothy 2 and we see Paul telling some women that they should not be teaching, we're like, we can't say this is a blanket ban
Yeah.
because we see Paul commending women who are serving in these types of leadership roles. So clearly, what Paul is doing in this particular circumstance is talking to a particular church about some problems that are going on there, which makes which is exactly what we know Paul is doing. The only time we sort of take out these commands of Paul and say they apply blanketly is
Yeah.
when they are about women.
Yeah, it's
And
so fascinating
yeah,
because, like, yeah, all these letters to churches are, here's a problem that's happening that let me
right,
help you. Let's talk about it. Here's a particular issue and for this particular time. And when you contextualize it, you do learn some new and different things about like what were women doing in the church?
right,
What was women's role in worship and wherever that was, and that does lead to some interesting conversations. I think if somebody has a question in good faith, they can, even if they are steeped in like the everything I've been told is women aren't allowed to
right.
have these things, that there is a as a starting place for people. And so if somebody was to have coffee with you and they were
Yeah,
like, I don't even know where to start. And like, okay, I'm willing to entertain some of these things that you're saying, that you're not trying to destroy my faith
right,
or good theology. Where would you want them to start? I mean, they could read your whole book, but like,
right.
what's just like I want to dip my toes in and just sort of interact with the idea. This might be different than I thought.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always tell people to start with the Bible. Let's just go and look and see what women are doing. And that, I mean, that is just that really is always my starting place.
Yeah.
And this is why I also talk about the early church in both of my books, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. You know, I have a whole chapter called Where is Peter's Wife?
Yes.
Which is a really fun and thinking about what actually is in the Bible and what's not in the Bible. And what we find is instead of seeing these women in what we would consider to be submissive, stay at home sort of roles, and by I'm not saying you can't be stay at home. I'm just saying we don't see that pattern in the
Yeah.
Bible. That is actually a modern concept. And what we do see women doing, though, in the early church as well as in the Old Testament, are serving in leadership roles.
Yeah.
So, aside from Romans 16, another example that I use is Martha, and I will point people to Martha of Bethany's story. And there's a great article written by a scholar named Warren Carter called Get Martha Out of the Kitchen, in
Mm.
which he shows that the word that's used to describe the ministry of Martha is the same word that's used to describe the ministry of Paul and the
Wow.
other disciples. And so we categorize Martha's work as being domestic, but the Bible categorizes Martha's work as doing the same ministry as the male apostles.
Yeah.
And so it's like that to me, I mean, that often just stops people because they're like, what? Wait, the Bible says Martha was serving and was doing the same type of ministry as Paul?
Yeah.
Yes, she
Yes.
does. And I mean, that just in of itself makes people pause. And I found if I can just get people to pause, then I can get them to listen.
Yeah. You had pointed out in your book, your historian ability to thread the needle and tie it all together is so helpful. We don't all have access to the same sort of
Yeah.
way to find things that you do, or you sat down and used your years of
Yes.
training and brought this to us, which I am so thankful for. But you point out that some of the things that we point to as theological truths
Hmm.
about the way women are in the world really
Yeah.
is more influenced by the political movement of the day or the economic and
Yes.
what's happened economically. Tell me more about that because I thought that was fascinating when you talked about capitalism and
I'm
how that sort of
glad.
changed how
Yeah.
what women did with their lives.
I'm really glad that you picked up on that too. And that I have a short section that talks about sort of I think it's in The Rise of the Pastor's Wife, or maybe the chapter right after that. But nonetheless, it is when we think about what pastors' wives should do today.
Yeah.
And we think about them supporting their husband's ministry in the church, but we also think about them as sort of this domestic goddess, this person who has, the parsonage, which is perfectly cared for, and parishioners can drop by at any time, and the wife is able to take the perfect casserole, et cetera. These are all the things we associate. And I also use Dorothy Patterson, who
Mhm.
remembers Paige Patterson's wife. And one of the things that she writes in her handbook for a minister's wife, and which was published for the first time in 2002, is that ministers' wives should be able to have the perfect cup of coffee or tea always available, which is I there's so many things I could say
Wow.
about that. But one of the things that as a medievalist that really caught my attention is that these types of household chores and domestic things that we associate women with are a product of the early modern world where we do see the emergence of this capitalist economy. And so one of the scholars I cite here is Catherine French, who is also a medievalist. And she has this great book called Good Households and Good Householders, I think is what it's
Okay.
titled. And one of the things that she finds in it is that before, sort of in the late medieval and up through, the 16th century, that men were actually the ones who were responsible for the domestic arrangements of houses. And that it was also in wealthier households, it was male servants that actually took care of domestic arrangements within
Mhm.
households. And it is not until we start to see the rise of a middle class, and some of the signifiers of a middle class was that you could afford better furniture or better
Mhm.
house furnishings, and you could have silver spoons, etc. And you could also have a wife who didn't have to work outside the home or whose whole labor was just supported within the household. And so this was a marker not of being a godly woman, but of being a successful business household in
Mm-hmm.
the early modern world. And yet these things with this emergence of this capitalist economy became associated with, sort of you think about that God blesses those who are, you know, economically. And so
Mm-hmm.
a prosperous household is also a sign of a godly household. And we begin to see the emergence of this wife who the household supports enough so that she can actually stay home and afford expensive things within the house is a marker of a godly family. And that whole image is completely driven by a changing historical context and not about the Bible at all.
Yeah. I mean, when you put it that way, it sounds, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm picturing Martha. She certainly
Yes.
wasn't like putting together a tea service and planning.
No. No. And
Yeah.
when we think about it, people often say, well, Martha presided over the table that Jesus sat at. And I'm like, well, yes, she did. But she wasn't doing that as a woman who was cooking the meal. She was doing that as a head of household,
Yeah.
and which is a very different status.
This
And
is
so
Martha's
not
household.
Yes, Martha's in charge of the household. She's not married. We have no indication of a husband or a father over her. And so she is serving as the head of household, and that's why she presides over the table.
Wow, that is so cool. I think it's cool.
I think it
Um,
is too.
and I think there's freedom in that, right? Like
Yes.
this isn't like stretching it, like a tiny, oh, this little, little known verse nobody's heard of. This is the get out of jail free card
Right.
for us. No, it's all throughout the whole thing, throughout
It
history, throughout
is.
scripture. And I think that's just really, really beautiful.
Yeah,
I love
I do
that.
too. I do too.
I have a friend who says that when you are like in an institution or a certain place and you see principles or rules, she says, that's institutional scar tissue. Something happened
Yeah.
at one point that caused them to have to come up with this new rule or new principle. And I'm thinking about that in regard to the way our churches these days, conservative churches like the SBC, talks about what women are allowed to do.
Mhm.
And you laid out very convincingly that people's ideas about this have not been the same.
Right.
They have changed throughout time.
Yeah.
So, like, what would you say is that institutional scar tissue that's more modern that
Yeah.
made like maybe the SBC go, oh, maybe we need a rule about these women
Yeah,
that is different
no,
than
I think
before.
that's a great question. So, I mean, I think one of them, if we can tie it back to the changing economy, is what happened after World War II.
Mm.
And after World War II, during World War II, a lot of women moved out of the house. They were encouraged to do this for the good of the country, etc. And then when the men started coming back home, these women were then encouraged to go back home. And we actually see this across culture. It's not just, the church promoted it, but broader American culture promoted it, trying to, this is the glorification of the household for women. And part of this really is a push to get men back into jobs. And the idea was to kind of help normalize society a little bit. And in doing that, the culture began to do things like women, when they got married, they get fired.
Mm.
Women, when they got pregnant, they would get fired.
Mhm.
Sort of this idea that women were supposed to be in the home. And you can imagine this is whiplash for women
Yeah.
who were being encouraged, really since
And we
World
don't need
War
to pay
One.
you as much anymore because,
Right.
the
Yeah,
man
because
is
now you're
supporting
getting
you.
married.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so a lot of women responded negatively to this. And this is sort of what we call, if we think about the rise of the feminist movement in the 1960s, in many ways is a product of this push to try to get women out of the workplace. And women are like, wait, 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 no, no, no. And a lot of men too actually support women during this. They're like, no, no, no. We want to stay in the workplace. And so we begin to see this push both legally as well as socially to allow women to break down gender barriers for women in the 60s and the 70s. And part of and this impacts the church. And one of the ways that it impacts the church is now we have women vying for pastoral positions
Mhm.
alongside men. I mean, that just honestly is part of this too. And we see as education barriers break down, more and more women begin to move into seminaries with the intention of not just being, getting religious education degrees, but
Mhm.
actually moving into the pastoral ministry. And so there starts to see a lot of concern as we see more women moving into these roles and more freedom for women to be able to move in these roles. We see churches that have been primarily dominated by male pastors being like, whoa, wait a minute,
Yeah.
what's going on here? And another piece that I throw in this is also there is changing rules about ordination that are sponsored by the government in the US, by the IRS, because there are so many people claiming the clergy tax credits.
Mhm.
And that actually is also, I mean, that to me was a fascinating part of the story to kind of see how the push against women's ordination parallels also this changing laws about who gets to claim the clergy tax credit.
I mean, if it was
Um,
so ubiquitous, they felt like wasn't as could not convince the government that it actually was a special status if all these women could be ordained.
right. Yeah, and I mean, it's not super clear, what we know is that like for the Southern Baptist Convention, they were trying to help more people claim the clergy tax status, which I think they were mostly imagining men. And so they actually spoke out and made people who were missionaries, ministers of the gospel is what they called them. And then they were like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden we start seeing women claiming, wanting to be ordained. And we see a direct response from that in the SBC where they qualify that. And they're like, wait a minute, no, no. Yes, missionaries, ministers of education, et cetera, can be ordained unless they're women. And
Hmm.
you see this qualification immediately. So we know that there is this concern about women being able to move into these same jobs as men, as well as being able to claim the same type of clerical status as men, which comes with economic benefits.
You talked about how at the same time the SPC is dealing with a sexual abuse crisis, which I would argue it's not new. It's new that people are aware of it, right? It's like
Right.
that it's been revealed in a way
Yeah.
that cannot be denied. Robert Downan's reporting and then the
Hmm.
following reporting that has happened for the last several years, and that has happened in a parallel line with this more hard line rule about
Yeah.
we really need to deal with these women who want to be, make sure we don't have women with pastor roles.
Right.
And I thought that was a really is sad
Yes.
and an interesting, just parallel to mention. Would you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, no, as I said, when I first started writing this book, I was following the evidence in the archives.
Yeah.
And in 2023, I was in the archives in June 2023 in Nashville.
Where I live.
And oh, is it? Well, there you
Yep.
are. I was
I'm
there.
just I'm just south of Franklin. Yeah.
I'm actually there a lot. My sister lives in Nashville, and so
That's
I
so
go
cool.
quite a bit. But anyway, I was in the archives. It's the week before the 2023 Southern Baptist Convention, and I was following a case of these women who were ordained in the early 80s. And I ran across a document that really surprised me. It was some pretty horrific accusations of clergy sex abuse that were being written to the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, saying that a pastor who was employed by the Home Mission Board in Washington, D.C. and what was fascinating is that the president of the Southern Baptist Convention was Jimmy Draper, who was also the president who presided over the 1984 SBC resolution, which said that women cannot be in pastoral positions because of the sin of Eve. And it was a
Mhm.
really hard line. It was an awful, the Southern Baptist Convention kind of moved away from it because they realized, I mean, that's a
The
horrible
sin of
way to
Eve
put
part.
it.
They,
Yeah, this because of the sin
yeah.
of Eve. But that's what happened in 1984. And at the same time, I found that this president, and it was several people on the executive board or in leadership in the SBC, became aware of these allegations against this man. And they ended up, and in fact, they learned that this man had confessed to it. And yet they decided to still allow this man to stay in this role. They said that he said he was sorry and had been, and we have to forgive and forget. And they said there's no evidence that he's done it again. So we're just going to leave him in this role.
Just one time.
And
Yeah.
it just, what really caught my attention was not so much, well, those would have caught my attention anyway because it
Yeah.
was this
Yeah.
horrific thing. But it was the same moment that the Southern Baptist Convention is making this move that, saying that women do not belong in pastoral leadership because of the sin of Eve. At the same time that we see this dismissal of these charges of clergy sex abuse that harmed women.
Yeah.
And yet we see this group of men being like, oh, well, he said he was sorry, and we'll just kind of let things be. And so this complete callous attitude towards harm and this protection of a pastor while also pushing women out of pastoral positions. And
Yeah.
it really closed a circle for me, I think.
And you point out how quickly they could move the SBC powers that be after claiming they have no authority, that they can move
Right.
really quickly with this fellowship being a church that has women with
Exactly.
pastor roles, while
Exactly.
at the same time saying, well, we're all autonomous churches. Like, what can I do about Johnny?
That's
I
exactly right.
can't do anything about Johnny. In fact, Johnny's not going to sue me, you
Yeah,
know?
and it's been this, in talking with people who are in the SBC, one of the things that they'll often point out, they're like, "Oh, the SBC actually only exists 2 days a year because it's just a convention that only exists, and then the executive board is empowered to act on behalf of the
Yeah.
SBC. But really, it's not really an entity; it's all just these local churches. But yet, at the same time, they still act with considerable power that influences all of these churches. And you could even think just recently where they declared that after the messengers at the Southern Baptist Convention have voted that they want to have this abuse database, sex abuse database, and then it was just announced that, hey, we're not going to
Yeah, the
prioritize that
executive
anymore.
committee seems to have a lot
Yep.
more power than they say. It seems to
So
be like when it's convenient, they have
that's
power.
exactly right. And so I kind of like, yes, they use it. It's very convenient how they apply, how they admit where they have power and when they have power and when they claim they don't have any power.
Yeah. Since I live here near Nashville, there's a lot of people probably even live in my community that work for Lifeway,
Yes,
but
absolutely.
which is an SBC entity. I just think there are all these people that are conveniently not even trying not to even see churches here that have women pastors.
Yes.
SBC, I think they want it both ways. And
Um,
why is that more important than something else?
and that was really what I tried to point out in this
Yeah.
chapter 8. And for those who haven't read it, I tell a a hard story actually about a pastor's wife who
Yeah.
was the unseen victim kind of behind what was, this was going on with this
Yeah, it's really
case of clergy
powerful.
sex abuse. And I think and what I really tried to point out is that while I think those SBC leaders who made that decision to not to leave this man and it was at the end of his really career, he's only works there for another like 3 years or 4 years, and then he resigns. But just because he retires, he doesn't just resign, he retires.
Yeah.
But this decision to leave this man in this position was made without ever investigating the impact that this man was having on
Oh, it
his
sounds,
family or his coworkers.
yeah.
It was just it's like, oh, okay, that's all we can do. You've done your due diligence. He doesn't seem to be causing any problems now. So we'll just, it's just this callousness,
Yeah.
this inability to see the impact on real women. And that was what I was, and part of this is what happens when we have leadership that is taught that men are, divinely ordained to have this type of authority over women and that you don't need women's voices at the table. And
Yeah.
what happens is we don't see women.
And being that woman that maybe later on finds out, Wait, you investigated my husband and you never even asked me
I know.
about, or like exonerated my husband and didn't ask me.
Yeah.
We
And
see that over and over again in Christianity and Christendom and the evangelical industrial complex. We're like, well, it's too complicated for us to come to a conclusion of who's right and who's wrong. So our decision will be what is the least costly for us to have to deal with in
and
the
I
short
think
term.
I think also the tendency is to protect the institution and the men who are in these positions rather than try to help these women.
Mm. Yeah, because the
And
message for the woman is, don't you want to be a part of this wonderful restoration plan and this
yes,
plan that God has for your husband? And it's going to be so beautiful.
that's
Just
exactly
hang in
right.
there.
Stand by your man. Stand by your man. I mean, that's the message that's given. I mean, it's like, why? Why do we privilege
Yeah.
men who are causing harm, whether directly or indirectly, over the women who are being harmed?
Yeah. Especially when there's
And
a long history of women being elevated in scripture
yes,
and
yes,
in history. Yeah.
and when we see God specifically reaching out and actually helping women who are in positions of being harmed. I mean, this is one of the things that we see. I'm teaching through the minor prophets in my Sunday school class right now. And
Yeah.
of course, over and over again, you're there, the accusations are you're not taking care of the
Yeah.
widows and the orphans and the poor. You're not taking care of the people who are being harmed. And this is exactly the pattern I see in the institutions of conservative evangelicalism is
Yeah.
that they are prioritizing male power over over the least of these.
At a certain point, we have a decision to make whether we're going to be a part of it or not.
Yes.
And for some of us, it's more costly than others. And I can understand some people that are like, I have a lot of other things happening right now. I can't do
Right.
this one thing that everybody thinks I should. But I am appreciative of the people that do their part, the people that can work in systems and the people that work outside of the system. Not everybody can do that. So we're all sort of carrying the baton, our stretch of the race, and hopefully doing the best that we can.
That's
As I
exactly
wrap
right.
this up, I would love for you to talk to the woman, probably a young woman that is really has gifts. She sees she has gifts in teaching and leading, and she wants to use them in the church. But
Yeah.
people have told her, you're going to probably have to find a dude that wants to be a pastor and marry him.
Yeah. That's
What would you
exactly
say
right.
to her?
I would say to her that God has always used women in pastoral ministry. God has always used women in the same type of leadership roles as men. And God continues to use women in all of these positions. I would want her to know that God is on her side and that she can use tools when people tell her that this is not her role, that is not the whole story, that there are Orthodox Christians out there, and Orthodox with a little O, Orthodox Christians out there who firmly support women serving in whatever role God has called them to. And so I would want her, one of the most beautiful things that was ever written to me was this young woman in China after I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And she got somebody to translate the letter and send it to me. And in it, she said, now I know that Jesus is for me and not against me. And
Mm.
that's what I would want this woman to know, that Jesus has always been for her and is not against women.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving me some of your time. I know you're a busy woman. I'm excited about your book coming out. When
Oh,
does it come
thank
out? How
you.
can we find it?
March 18th. It'll
Oh,
be
it's
out
soon.
everywhere. Yes, it is. If you pre-order, though, you get the best price. It's like 40% off at Baker Book House. So I'm encouraging people to
And
always save
sometimes when
money.
you order right from the publisher, sometimes they send it like a couple days early. You
They
just never
do.
know.
And they actually are sending them signed by
That's so
me
fun.
from Baker Book House. So if you order from Baker Book House, you might get one of the first 1,000 copies that is signed.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Beth. I appreciate
Thanks
your
for
time.
having me.